Today it's my great pleasure to introduce three organizers for the advanced seminar that's currently going on. Some of you may not know that by custom, the organizers of advanced seminars, which are mostly closed events, come and give us an update on what's been happening and what their sense is of where their discussions are going. In this case, the topic is how nature works, and you'll be hearing what the substance of that discussion is in a moment. So we'll hear from Sarah Beskey, who's assistant professor of anthropology and at the Watson Institute at Brown University, Alex Blanchette, who's assistant professor of anthropology at Tufts, and Nace Dave, who's associate professor, Department of Anthropology, University of Toronto. So I'll do the handoff to Sarah. Are you first up? So Sarah Beskey.
Hi. First, I just wanted to thank Michael Brown, thank Leslie Shipman in particular, and thank all of you and anyone who really helps to make this place and the advanced seminar possible. It's just been a rich and stimulating experience for all of us. It's a really, really special event and a really special place. So thank you for having us. So I'm Sarah Beskey, and along with Alex Blanchette and Nesargi Dave, we've organized this advanced seminar, called How Nature Works. We'll talk about what that means. And we'd love for this presentation to be a bit more conversational. Our seminar is, of course, very much underway. So we'd like to think more about the themes and the questions that we're going to raise over the next 30 or 35 minutes. And we've set out some time for questions at the end. So what we set out to do in this seminar, our How Nature Works seminar, is to consider how ethnographies of human interactions with plants and animals can reinvigorate a critique of labor. Since the Enlightenment, work, defined by John Locke as an act of altering nature to make one's own, has been framed as a uniquely human capability. The practical realization of such philosophy, however, has led to an irreversible point of no return, a damaged planet that is excessively saturated with human labor. Indeed, many responses to this crisis, compounded by an intensity of capitalism's recent inability to achieve stable economic growth, employment or growth, have been only able to forecast a future of more work. From geoengineering to intensive hydroponic food production, these themes reassert domination over nature. Each promise a return to a pre-planetary crisis or a pre-planetary state through human innovation and will. So we propose, however, that in the late industrial world, this late industrial world is not so much polluted as perhaps it is overworked. As a philosophical and political response to this potential state of overwork, as well as perhaps an implicit normative assumptions about how much work is enough or too much, the seminar tracks not simply human work on nature, but instead seeks to develop a language for reimagining how nature works. The seminar is thus motivated by an idea that the ongoing entangled ecological and economic crises will require a critical reconsideration of labor as the overarching measure of human uniqueness, value, and social merit. So if we accept that climate change and planetary mutations are largely irreversible, then we must take seriously the capacity of the non-human world to work on us, against us, and perhaps even with us. Indeed, as the sheer depth of damage has become apparent, scholarship has started to articulate how the status of the human is inseparable from our relationships and forms to other forms of life, how the idea of the human is inseparable from relationships to other forms of life. Much of this so-called post-humanist writing pushes past the doctrine of human exceptionalism and reimagines our entanglement with nature, especially by tracing how capacities to communicate and form affective ties are shared across species. But feminist theories, along with environmental theorists and along with environmental historians, first paved the way for this research by articulating how there is no such thing as a pristine, untouched nature, describing how humanity has come to know the world through working engagements with nature, from cloned sheep to fluvial ecosystems. By bringing together this burgeoning post-human sensibility with issues of classic concern in political economy, this seminar seeks to go further, to theorize the strengths and limitations of ascribing the so-called natural world, or something we could perhaps even see as a post-natural world, its own working agencies over humankind. Such a melding also helps us reframe work as an analytical concept and moves it to the scholarly forefront at a time when labor studies oddly lack prominence in environmental studies and social theory, perhaps particularly in anthropology. Anthropology has long critiqued conditions of wage labor as dehumanizing, as alienating people from the things that they produce, from the non-human world of nature, and importantly, from one another. Ethnography has played a central role in pushing against abstract sociologies and economics that frame people as homogeneous inputs, fueling capitalist accumulation, returning texture and meaning to scholarly depictions of laborers' lives. So in spite of this focus on these more than human capacities, the seminar extends this tradition by exploring the experience of other forms of life embedded into labor and of others that exist in the world. So our selected seminar participants have been path-breaking in doing exactly this, and analyzing how capitalism, science and technology, and intimate relationships structure the lives of many people and many of the world's species. This includes studies of the indigenous guinea pigs that fueling the Peruvian gastronomic boom, the honeybees underlining the design of military drone technology, the soybeans paving over rural Paraguay, the diseases that arise from a confluence of heat and pesticide exposure, the rhythms of matsutake mushroom foraging in the Pacific Northwest, the development and intensification of ginseng cultivation in the Korean demilitarized zone, the animals that enable alternative forms of political belonging, the plantation ecologies that affect post-colonial aspirations, the projects of rehabilitating captive orangutans in Southeast Asia, and the pigs of factory farms whose habitat serves as models for industrial planning. We'll talk more about those. Together, this scholarship forms the basis for this more than human approach to labor that can produce theory accountable to this moment of economic and ecological instability. It does so by taking seriously the creativity of other species. So to be clear, however, this seminar is not straightforwardly a site of celebrating the possibilities of this more than human theory of labor, but instead one where we will also debate, and where we are debating still this morning and tomorrow, of ascribing work beyond the human, and the politics of pitching the category of labor into the very ontology of the world. So going beyond the non-standard observation in science studies that non-human beings have agency in the world, so going beyond this idea that non-humans have agency, a focus on a more than human labor brings attention to where the boundaries between species symbiosis and antagonism are blurry, often really blurry, to the messy interactions caused by extraction and exploitation. So we're asking, how might a more than human perspective of work and perspective on work potentially expand our anthropological lexicon of nature and capitalism? How does a human exceptionalism with respect to work blind us from seeing the creativities of other species? What is an adequate definitional framework for a type of work that might extend across other forms of life? How might letting go of our exclusive ownership of work, as humans, exclusive ownership of work, enable more livable and equal exchanges across species, or shared distributions of work? In sum, what would it mean to both see the capacity of work as extending beyond the human and imagine new political possibilities in a world less organized around human work? So what we are working towards now in our discussions is producing this hopefully a path-breaking book on labor and nature, one that not only makes theoretical innovations, but serves as a model for how humanistic scholarship can respond to this state of planetary crisis. The book itself will be tied together by a commitment to recapturing ethnography as a domain of philosophical inquiry, one that is attuned to how life on an irreversibly altered planet demands shifts in styles and practices of social thought, perhaps narrative writing as well. So for the remainder of our time together, we're going to walk through the papers and the contributions more in depth, and then close with some overarching themes that we see the seminar kind of contributing to. Okay, so first we'll start off with Nace's paper. Nace is, again, one of the co-organizers of the seminar. And the paper is on the politics of refusal. This paper has provoked each of us, right, in the seminar to ask, what would it mean to refuse work? Maybe you can ask yourself that. In Nace's argument, refusal brings into relief what work is and what it means. The paper focuses on the dream, the dream state, a phenomenon that Nace explains just happens. It can exist out of context, right? It's context. The dream can exist out of context. The paper then takes on context and context building, key tasks, perhaps, of ethnographic labor. Context building is part of the axiomatic project of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange, after all. Context, we are told, is what makes ethnography matter. But what if we refuse context? Quoting from the paper, the difference between what matters for anthropology and what does not matter for anthropology comes down to the question of context. That is, what can be or what is contextualized within normative frames that we already accept and understand, right? And understand the significance of these things, right? Things like labor, capitalism, violence, religion, the state, culture, ontology. Right? The significance of these things such that what is unruly, magnificent, strange, or remarkable, that is life itself, can be mastered, neutered, and made useful in a workable and made useful and workable for theory and thought. So the paper's contributions lie in asking what possibilities might emerge from this refusal of mattering, this refusal of context, this refusal of making things matter. If we take mattering as ethnographic work, then what would it look like in all of our contexts to not work? Nace bases her exploration of the problem on the refusal of an Indian animal rights activist's own recollection of his confrontation with a cow's refusal to provide milk, to work for people. Animals, Nace argues, teach us what we know as work. What we know as work is often, we can think about through what we know as refusal. So John Hartigan is a professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin. And he writes about bacterial flagellar motors. Not normally, right, a subject of ethnographic inquiry, but an astute one nonetheless, right? And flagellar motors and the social labor, importantly, that they perform. Bacterial flagellar motors are these little whip-like extensions on bacteria, which are actually many, many times stronger than human-made motors. Flagellar motors produce their social labor in specific cultures of agar cultivated on petri dishes. The goal of the paper is to reorient, to open up cultural analysis so as to include non-humans, while also learning from the ways life scientists mobilize the concept of culture. The paper then scales down social analysis at the scale of the human, to apply it to bacteria. So we have the scale up, scale down kind of dynamic. At the same time, the paper, is looking at biologists' use of culture from the petri dish. So it models this form of analysis that we as cultural anthropologists can perhaps work with. The narrative of the paper works recursively, articulating a series of iterations in three key terms: motor, labor, and culture. By toggling back and forth to the different orientations and thus connotations of this key set of terms, the paper works to loosen the associations that these things we think we know, perhaps motor, labor, culture, and unsettle them from a human reference. Perhaps most significant here is the loosening of culture from an equation which makes humans unique. And thirdly, Maria Elena Garcia is an associate professor in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. And her paper explores the Peruvian gastronomic boom and how it's turned the guinea pig into a national symbol. This boom enabled, in Maria Elena's words, the power of the guinea pig to become visible. In the context of Peru's move from terror to tourism, the guinea pig has become visible through processes of fusion, of the mixture of cultural, racial, and culinary influences. In the paper, Maria Elena's Peruvian friends describe the guinea pig as a symbol of possibility. For them, the animal has the power to save the country. Maria Elena's paper takes the power of the guinea pig seriously. The guinea pig has the power to produce affect. It also has the capacity to make indigenous people more legible to the structures of political power, at least in some ways. And the production of affect is becoming an extremely lucrative business in Peru. The paper helps us think through both the material and semiotic figurations of non-human work, the work of the guinea pig. It opens up our scale of analysis, thinking back to John's paper about non-human work, in this case, work for the nation. And my paper explores the phenomenon of tea plantation abandonment in the Doors region of Northeast India. And when I came to the Doors in late 2015, it seemed like a mass abandonment of plantations was underway. Over the previous 2 decades, dozens of tea plantations in the region had closed. Companies claimed that operating plantations had become too expensive. Tea bushes are old, they're overworked. The Nepali and Adivasi laborers who pluck tea from these bushes are also old and overworked. Companies claim that they can no longer afford to maintain the plants or laborers on plantations. Despite the many signs and an ever-expanding commitment to tea cultivation has made life harder in the Doors, few seem willing to abandon tea. I ask, what is keeping people here? What is keeping people and tea together? And how the work of nature might play a role in this togetherness. I'm interested in what happens when what was once exclusively a plantation crop becomes a regional monoculture, when it spreads outside of the bounds of the plantation. I ask how monoculture works. I suggest that despite all of the dreams of alienation, monocultures work when they work by drawing capital, labor, and technologies to them and keeping them there. Thanks.
Hello. This is a little bit of a flashback. This is my 5th talk here. So I'm Alex Blanchette, and I once had the indescribable privilege of spending a year at the SAR as a Weatherhead Fellow. I'm finishing up a book called Porkopolis, American Animality's Standardized Life in the Factory Farm, which was first drafted here as a dissertation. And it's based on workplace research in a region of the Great Plains that manufactures 7 million pigs per year. So my paper's pretty simple in a sense. It's about the intimate human labor that underlies uniform pork, tracing how industrialization in confinement barns is not a process of human-animal detachment like we typically expect, but instead where people must form deep and painful ties with suffering hogs. As a whole, my essay argues that the factory farm work is not a straightforward matter of human domination over hogs, but instead something more complex, one where diverse migrant workers come to be exploited through the biologies of damaged pigs. In other words, I'm trying to start to think worker rights and animal rights together. Thomas Andrews is a professor of history at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's published widely on matters of nature and work, leading to his Bancroft Prize-winning book on Colorado frontier labor politics, Killing for Coal. This book tried to do no less than reimagine what manual work is, pushing past broad abstractions and hoary dualisms that separate man and nature in so much of Western thought. When people work, Andrews argues, distinctions between nature and culture melt away as laboring beings change and are changed by an environment that remains always under construction. By focusing on workers' intimate forms of engagement with earth, air, fire, mice, and even mules in the mine shafts of Colorado, his work has reinterpreted the nature of class politics and labor struggle. Indeed, this book illustrates how forms of labor consciousness that led to strikes and infamous incidents of political violence, such as the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, are inseparable from workers' engagements with non-human beings and ecologies. Thomas has been serving as the discussant for our seminar, essentially doing his very best to keep us honest and attuned to the broad history of intellectual engagement with working landscapes. Juno Pereñas is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at The Ohio State University. Her forthcoming book is titled Decolonizing Extinction, the Work of Care in Orangutan Rehabilitation. Pereñas' work is based in Borneo, and it traces paradoxes of human work that are required to train critically endangered orangutans born in captivity to forage semi-autonomously, that is, without the assistance of indigenous Sarawakian laborers. In so doing, she writes at once a detailed history of changing modes of care in the face of extinction, an analysis of how both human and orangutan lives change alongside patterns of wage labor in contemporary capitalism. Juno's paper provokes us to think about how human and orangutan work is not just natural, but is rather shaped and compelled within broader economic and ethical structures at a moment when rehabilitation centers are now becoming sites of tourism and profit. To wrap up mine, Craig Hetherington is an associate professor of anthropology at Concordia University, who has written extensively on peasant struggles, land transformation, and the making of government in Latin America. His paper for our seminar is a historical and ongoing account of the soy boom in Paraguay, one that traces agrarian responses to the devastation of lives and landscape that follow in this commodity's wake. Attuned to the language and slogans of his activist informants, Craig's essay tells a story of how campesino lives have been formed through histories of embodied engagement with prior commodity crops, such as cotton, and how these experiences provide a means of critiquing the new era of soy, deadly pesticides, and harvesting machines. As a whole, Hetherington's paper pushes against capitalist narratives that frame the soy frontier and the Green Revolution more generally as a site of vital abundance, tracing simultaneously mundane and overwhelming forms of killing work that underlie capitalist export agriculture.
Hi, I'm Naisargi. So Shiho Satsuka is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto. Her paper, Rhapsody in the Forest, Wild Mushroom and Multispecies Multitude, brings our attention to mushrooms, not as a site of toil per se, that is, labor in the sense of work or exertion, but as a site of rhythm, passion, and pleasure. Her focus is simultaneously on the humans who pick matsutake mushrooms, as well as the mushrooms themselves. The picker here is not a subject outside of the mushroom, one who seeks and picks what he wants, but rather both human and fungus are engaged in the work of rhythmically enticing one another into their respective orbits. This is an enchanted way of thinking about work, and it is precisely that quality of enchantment and wonder that marks its contribution to our larger project. Culturally, we tend to valorize work because it requires something of us, and because of what it says about us as individuals. In Satsuka's rendering, though, work is the creative, that is to say, not only exertive labor of bringing what is separate, individuals and species, into a rhythmic encounter with one another. Alex Nading is lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Edinburgh and deputy director of the Edinburgh Centre for Medical Anthropology. Nading's paper is called Heat and of as Work and focuses on everyday lives in Ciudad Sandino, Nicaragua. The conventional way that medical ethnographies of work think about heat, Nading argues, is that social relations, that is, having to work in certain kinds of conditions, expose people to dangerous levels of heat. Nading, though, wants to bring our attention to the reverse, that heat exposes people to the social relations of which they are a part. Heat, in this reversed understanding, is not a monolithic externality that acts upon people, but instead is the very condition of social relations. Social relations of sickness and disease, yes, but also of political mobilization and new forms of care. Heat works not on, but with. It works as we do socially. Alina Kim is Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of California, Irvine. Her paper is titled Metabolic Relations, Korean Red Ginseng and the Ecologies of Modern Life. Kim's paper is set in the DMZ region of South Korea, where the growth of red ginseng for export and other consumption flourishes. One of the central ironies of Kim's paper is that the particular ecological destructiveness of ginseng, its nutritional devastation of the land that it grows upon, such that it becomes worthless for other crops, is a central aspect of its chemical efficacy and desirability for humans, who consume it as a panacea against stress and disease. There are multiple players in this story, from the military to people who work for the conservation of cranes whose habitat has been destroyed by the infrastructure required for the growth of this ginseng. Those activists themselves consume ginseng, precisely as a way to relieve the stresses of ecological devastation. Kim uses the concept of metabolism to understand these tangled relationships of affect in agriculture, As in Satsuka's paper and also in Nading's, Kim's attempt here to show the more than human co-constitution of working subjects through how they absorb one another, literally and as concepts. Finally, Jake Kosick is associate professor in the geography department at the University of California, Berkeley. His paper is titled Industrial Materials, Labor, Landscapes, and the Industrial Honeybee. Kosick begins the paper startlingly with an accident. A beekeeper's truck carrying 900 hives containing 17 million bees swerves and crashes. Millions of bees died, others escaped, and the Forest Service as well as the police were brought in to deal with the scene, which shut the highway down for hours. Jake begins with this accident, which led to the massive waste of bees and human and non-human labor. To say that in modern beekeeping, there is actually no such thing as an accident, even though everyone has one eventually, and he is quoting a beekeeper here. Accidents such as these, or huge waste such as this, are actually the concerted products of the reorganization of the beekeeping industry for modern agriculture. The very making of the modern bee necessitates quote-unquote accidents. They are bred, in a sense, to be disposable. Jake's story boggles the mind. The sheer number of bees required to pollinate almond crops is itself stunning, as well as the realization of our utter dependence on the labor and killing of the honeybee. It is a kind of planned obsolescence, things created in order to die. This ties into one of the larger points of the seminar thus far, that of the ultimate inextricability of agriculture and killing, and following from that, the ethical questions raised by that inevitability. So having introduced you to some of these papers and participants, we'll move on to discussing three of the major themes that have arisen so far. We'll each take one in turn. The one that I'm going to handle is, we'll call it refusal, reduction, care, play, and leisure. What is outside of work? So the concept of overwork, as stated in our proposal and in the presentation Sarah made, makes one fundamental assumption, that there is a level of work that is reasonable, and it is only the work over and above that level of reasonable labor that should be called into question. In other words, it could be argued that the very notion of overwork implies that work itself is reasonable or natural. But over the course of our discussions, and embedded in the proposal itself, is a critique of that very idea, through the suggestion, perhaps, that all work is overwork. It is not overwork that should be resisted, but work itself. This, as the feminist scholar Kathy Weeks calls it, is a politics of refusal, a politics that refuses to expand the work ethic by simply absorbing more beings into it. Mushrooms work hard, pigs work hard, plantations work hard, but argues instead that all work stinks, and none of us, including the non-human, should do any of it. Now, granted, there is a deliberately polemical aspect to that idea of refusal. What would it mean or look like to actually refuse all work, or to refuse work, period? But even if we want to reject that strong argument, it also then enables what is perhaps a more practical politics, a politics of reduction of work. By engaging with work as something forced from us, as refusal politics does, rather than something inherently valuable or noble, we press at least for its reduction, both in amount and in the moral weight that is culturally accorded. The question then arises across all of the papers that are engaging with a critique of work, of what the space of non-work actually is. What do we do when we're not working? And is that stuff actually not working? This comes up in Junot's paper with the orangutans who, even when sleeping and wandering, practices of leisure par excellence, are forms of forced work within the context of this sanctuary. So then if leisure is not outside of work, perhaps some of us have asked, care or love or intimacy is outside of work. But then this leads us to one of the central tensions of this particular project of ours, holding a critique of work alongside an attention to interspecies relationality. The tension arises because this latter thing, attention to interspecies relationality, suggests or usually involves some form of care. We see this in Alex Blanchette's paper, in Alina's and Shiho's, and many of them. Humans care about the species they encounter in spaces of work, politics, and play. The problem then, though, is that care requires work. For the rehabilitation workers to care about the orangutans requires them to work more, to be overworked beyond what the job description suggests. So then if care too is work, then what is work, period? And what boundaries do we draw around the concept in order to enable and produce a political, efficacious critique of work?
So we actually lied. We're much slower talkers than we imagined we are. So we're going to do two themes, and we want to have time for discussion and questions, because we know we're throwing quite a bit out there, and we don't want to overrepresent the seminar because we're right in the middle of it, and we're really debating a lot of questions right now. But nonetheless, one of the major and slightly unexpected empirical themes of the seminar has been about the global intensification of industrial agriculture and monocropping. Many papers center on the reorganization of vast portions of the earth around maintaining populations of single plants or animals in place. They've been about the amount of human activities and energies required to make beings like tea or ginseng seem to stand alone in an ecology. In the broadest sense, many commentators outside of this seminar tend to frame monocrop agricultures in terms of stasis and non-human domination. First, in the anthropological literature, there's an often assumption that industrial agriculture is all the same. That industrial agriculture has been a matter of simplifying, manufacturing, and taking life that has operated in similar ways since the early sugar plantations of the Caribbean. However, many of our papers push back against exactly this. They illustrate the perhaps ironic diversity of global monocultures, of how agribusiness cannot eradicate the specificities and histories of place. Moreover, our papers collectively theorize the incredible amounts of human and non-human work, often unpaid and unrecognized, both physical and organizational, required to maintain and intensify these one-to-one interspecies relationships over time. In so doing, we've been complicating what is perhaps the central tenet of industrial food production, namely that these monocultural operations consume less human labor to generate food and fuel. Instead, our papers push back against these two simple stories of clean engineering, profits, and human mastery. They ethnographically focus on how human communities and laborers become reorganized into and often dominated through intimate relationships with single species. We are all suggesting, though in extremely different ways, that the lives and deaths of industrialized organisms, from soy to guinea pigs, are inseparable from questions of workers' rights, dignity, class inequalities, freedom, and racial justice. Ethnographically, exploring the ongoing work of making monocultures stick and flourish, or as we have put, or at least I've put it, a process of monoculturing, has brought up a host of unanticipated conceptual and political questions. Some essays explore counterintuitive types of wildness in highly engineered species. They query domestication's instability, incompleteness, and side effects. Wildness in nature in industrial agricultural spaces might not be something that indicates a separation from human activity, as it is typically taken, but instead something that emerges from attempts to gain so-called mastery over non-human beings. Other arguments push against industrial narratives of lively abundance, examining how much interspecies killing and death is involved in making organisms proliferate at a large scale. And a third strand of argument is to query why we only notice and acknowledge the human labor in places like plantations and factory farms. Industrial agriculture, after all, is only possible by corralling the activities and vital processes of non-human beings, transforming them into co-workers that make possible the efficacy of human labor. So some of the ideas that we're still developing around these topics ask what it might mean to translate ideas from prior histories of labor struggle onto these creatures, along with how critiquing the work that these animals or plants are made to do might also provide opening for dialogue with alternative agricultures such as agroecology. In short, what would a politics of refusing the work of other beings look like? Thank you. And we'll